So welcome to another episode of this podcast. We have Lyra here today.
Hello.
And we've been looking forward to this episode, right?
Yes.
And because it's one of the things, we have been talking a lot about local issue, election, but today we want to go far, far away to another place, but very relevant to Malaysia as well. Don't you think so? And we want to talk about affirmative actions. The recently Supreme Court case in United States, striking it down. Now, of course, in Malaysia, this is nothing new to us, right?
Yep.
But we want to look at the case proper, and then maybe next week or when time is available, we will try to do an analysis on how it applies to Malaysia.
Yep.
All right, so this case was handed out just a few days ago, and it's actually called Students for Fair Admissions versus Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College. And also, it's a case against University of North Carolina. We're just going to call it the Harvard and UNC case for abbreviation, okay? So I think, Lara, I'm just going to go through the quick facts of the case and lay out the things. Now, legal cases can be very complicated, but this is one that it is relatively short and quite easy to read, right? Don't you think so?
Yes, it is.
So we will put the link directly to the Supreme Court of the United States in our video or Spotify, and you can read it if you really have the interest. It's not that long, I think, 50 or 60 pages. So anyway, there's this NGO, right? And it's called Students for Fair Admissions. And it's so strange, right? Why do you need an NGO to fight for fair admission?
Exactly.
You and I, we both study overseas. Have you ever thought when you apply, maybe there will be certain disadvantage to you because you are an Asian?
No, of course not.
Yeah, you study in UK, I study in Australia. This never come across our mind, right? And yet, are you shocked to find out that it was a practice in most of the universities in United States for the last 50 years?
Yeah, most definitely. I was completely shocked. I mean, I thought just the name itself of the NGO, Students for Fair Admissions. I mean, we don't even have it here in Malaysia.
I mean, in Malaysia, we know affirmative actions, university quotas, these are nothing unusual. But for it to happen in USA, we just find it very, very... And as I read the case, we realize, hey, it has been going on for a while and it's a long fight. So anyway, what happened was this NGO decided to file many lawsuits against various universities, and eventually two stick around. And the first case was against University of North Carolina, already mentioned UNC, and it's based on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Now we're going to talk about that a bit later. Then the second one is against University of Harvard under Title VI of Civil Rights Act 1964. Now, why is this important? And I think we're just going to break it down for the benefit of our viewers and listeners. The first thing is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution actually is what they call equal protection clause. But then there's a limitation. It only applies to state university.
Yep.
So that was a clause we were just discussing earlier on, which came around after the Civil War and made sure that the states, because the whole thing about the Civil War was all the states were treating slaves differently, and they want to make sure that everyone has equal protection. So that's why the limitation of that amendment is that it only applies to state universities and state entities.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the context of this whole 14th Amendment is really coming out from basically when all the slaves were being freed, liberated. Yep. So, but the thing is, at that time, there was a push for how do we treat these servants?
Yep.
I mean, this group of people.
Correct.
So it was really interesting because the way that the whole founding and all these presidents, they really just look at all this thing and really just say all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So that also includes slaves.
Correct.
Which we should treat them as equal. So that is such a profound truth of this 14th Amendment.
Yeah, and of course when people, these days you have all the revisionists, right? They try to say the original founders were racist slave owners. But then they did declare all men were created equal.
Yep. And
of course, the understanding at that time, the expression at that time was not fully manifested yet. And, the society at that time, basically, the economy at that time, very dependent on slaves.
Yeah.
And by the time Civil War, you had the North and South. Why Lincoln, of course, we can talk about his moral ground, his personal view, but there is an economic reality also. The North simply did not need to rely so much on slaves. So imagine you are an economy that doesn't require slaves. Let everyone be free. It's very easy for you to say that.
Indeed.
So that's why there is this kind of complex consideration that a lot of revisionists, they try to avoid. And this is where we get the whole critical race theory, which is relevant but not quite the crux of today's discussion. But you're absolutely right about the 14th Amendment. And so the NGO knew about the limitations, so they decided to go another additional angle also, which is Title 6 of Civil Rights Act 1964. And why is this important? Because that provision cover racial discrimination of institutions that accept federal tax money, such as grants, tuition aid, etc., etc. When you use that kind of definition, almost all the universities in America are included. So it's almost like they need to cover the whole lot.
Throw in the net.
But anyway, let's talk about the decisions. So by a decision of 6-3 in the UNC case and 6-2 in the Harvard case. Why 6-2? Because Ketanji Brown recused herself in the Harvard case. I think she had some official appointment in Harvard University even at this moment.
No, I think she was also a graduate from Harvard University.
Yes, actually a lot of them were, but
Yeah.
I think after a certain number of years, the bias, conflict of interest kind of expire.
Yep.
I mean, like Alito and Thomas, they are like so old already, in comparison. They are like dinosaurs, So, but anyway, what the Supreme Court held was that racial preference. And very interestingly, that in 1978, in the Beck case, Supreme Court called the whole thing affirmative actions. So 45 years ago, they say affirmative action is correct. So that's I just found it astounding because in Malaysia, we fully understand this. We experience that. Most people who apply for local university, you expect quota, you expect not getting what you want despite your good results and performance. But in America, a land of freedom, a land where you can pursue the American dream, so very shocking.
I guess it's almost like what you frequently mention outside of this podcast, that a lot of times the maturing democracy, you have a pendulum that really swings from one end to the other end, and until such a time that the whole democracy matures, the whole conscience, I think, is just developing sort of thing. So it's like a progress for the nation to decide what they really want to strike for their own identity. So I think it's also the same for Malaysia as well. Maybe it was relevant back then, back in the 70s. Yes, maybe because of some of the racial riots and things like that, maybe there was a need for affirmative action to just happen in Malaysia. But I felt like because the affirmative action in Malaysia through new economic policy, it had a time frame, that 20 years, it has long expired. So I felt like because of that, should Malaysians start reviewing all these sort of things, So I guess it's the same for United States as well, that after 50 years, they decided that this is the time to review this whole decision.
Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned the NEP because we also know the Constitution of Malaysia does provide for the special rights of Malay. By the way, do you know that provision is also in Singapore's Constitution? The Singapore Malay also have a special right, but the detail was not outlined.
So amazing.
Yes. So here's the thing, and some people were analyzing that. The special rights and NEP are not related at all. The special right means your religion is official. The special right means certain language can be official. By the way, Bahasa Melayu is official language of Singapore. So we can separate the two, but somehow the two have been merged. But I think when you look at what the unity government is trying to do, when you look at Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, he has been saying a lot. We need to move away from looking at race to looking at needs. So I think it's a very subtle, maybe indirect admission that NEP had failed. But anyway, all those in another episode. Okay, we don't want to get sidetracked, but it's very interesting that we need to think, because I think in Malaysia, we understand this better than most other nations. But anyway, coming back to the decision itself, the majority and the judgment was written by Justice Roberts, joined by 5 others: Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett. And I'm going to quote the whole thing because it's useful, okay? And he said, quote, "The Constitution deals with substance, not shadows, and the prohibition against racial discrimination is level at the thing, not the name. A benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, must be tied to that student's courage and determination." What a good quote. "Or a benefit to a student whose heritage or culture motivated him or her to assume a leadership role or attain a particular goal must be tied to that student's unique ability to contribute to that university. In other words, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race." End of quote. I think you can't get a clearer smackdown of affirmative action. Not what you look like, not your skin color. And that's the whole thing about the identity politics today, right? That we talked about earlier on before the recording. It's like, of course, skin color is the most obvious one, but it could be your religion, it could be your ideology, it could be how woke you are, and it could be how ESG you are.
Yeah.
And the more, then you are like, you are the progressive. So I just find all this, of course, the whole sexual fluidity kind of thing, which, of course, even in America right now, they are facing a huge backlash because society eventually will not tolerate your nonsense, right? So I thought that was very, very clear. But then Justice Clarence Thomas, he wrote a additional separate judgment because he wanted to highlight the 14th Amendment, which Lara, you already kind of summarized it in a very, very clear way. But let's look at what Thomas said and quote in his separate judgment. "In the wake of the Civil War, the country focused its attention on restoring the Union and establishing the legal status of newly freed slaves. The Constitution was amended," so that's where the 14th Amendment come in, "to abolish slavery and proclaim that all persons born in the United States are citizens, entitled to the privileges or immunities of citizenship and the equal protection of the laws. Because of the second founding, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." End of quote. It's like having a black Supreme Court justice to say this, I think is very, very important. But we've been talking, right? Did you look at some of the dissenting judgment? What was their angle? Maybe you can share a little bit here before we move into the case itself.
Yeah, basically Justice Clarence Thomas, he took on Justice Jackson's dissent. So I thought it was very interesting because he basically mentioned that, so we are talking about Justice Jackson here. So we have to go back a little bit on her nomination.
Mm-hmm.
Basically because she's a direct beneficiary of this whole racial preference.
Yep.
So that sort of affirmative action, because basically President Joe Biden, at the time of nomination, he specifically mentioned that he wanted a black woman into the whole court. So bearing in mind that she is really a direct recipient of this whole racial preference, but yet she was saying that ignoring race just makes it matter more. So it's so interesting because it's like, what are you thinking as a black person? It's almost like, are you saying that this is right for the society to do so, that you should look at my color and not my performance? So indirectly, is she like undermining her own intellectual, So I felt like it's because of that, there is such a contrasting ideas that is really conflicting ideas that is just going on in her mind, that on one hand, you say that because one of her famous quote when she mentioned that she was being appointed, she said she does not look into all this, what her belief does not really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sense that when she is deciding on the cases, the race sort of ideology, it will not come into play. So that was what she was saying during the nomination process. And yet during this case, it was a completely manifestation, if you will.
Yep. And I sometimes when you hear people like that, and remember another Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, who is now, of course, Attorney General, I mean, look at the way he runs the Department of DOJ. It's just unbelievable. How can someone like this be considered a nominee for Supreme Court of the United States? Because that person really have no respect and honor for the rule of law. So it's like, when you play identity politics, then you're bound by that. So sometimes, you're absolutely right. When I look at what they say, did they even realize what they are saying? It's like, maybe they do, maybe it's all a setup, we're in here because we want to change the way things work. But sometimes I just have a feeling that they are sucked into the whole ideology, and they have to go against it because that's the very basis of their appointment. Almost like the very basis of their legitimacy, don't you think?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. But when we look at the case, and one of the very interesting commentary we found, and we kind of enjoyed that, right? Tucker Carlson, of course, when he was still at Fox, and I think it was around beginning of November last year. That was when the Scotters decided they will hear these two cases. And he did like a real smackdown, right, on the whole issue. And I'm just going to read some selected quote from him because, and this one, he started off, he said, "Look, the promise of a meritocratic society by merits is that the most capable person will rise to the positions of the greatest authority. In a meritocracy, for example, you will hire heart surgeons because they are good at heart surgery, not because of how they look or who their parents are." I mean, it's like, when it comes to medical treatment, I think nobody has any... If you are dying, you want the best, right?
Most definitely.
Or I mean, even things like, if you are charged with a crime that potentially has a death penalty, would you want to get the best criminal lawyer you can afford?
Definitely.
Not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry, right?
Yeah, because when it's dealing with life and death issue, I mean, you're not gonna play around and say that, oh, racial matters more, or what your belief system matters more. It's based on their skill set.
Yeah, it's so absurd. And he continued, and he said, "A meritocracy is the only fair way to run a society, and fairness matters to people almost everywhere." And I think we can really attest to that in Malaysia, right? A lot of people felt that sense of unfairness with the affirmative actions. And I think that's probably the number one reason why people migrated. Number two reason would be Singapore dollar and Malaysia, the exchange rate. But I think the first and foremost is the sense of unfairness. Most people who migrated that I know of, it's not because life is not good here. It's not because they are not happy. It's because of that sense of unfairness which they couldn't reconcile. And that sort of become a little bit of bitterness, unfortunately. So most of the one that I know, that's their starting point. But anyway, he continued. Meritocracy works well. Fewer people die on the operating table when you do it this way. For generations, this is how American society run. That's why when the Supreme Court case in 1978 came out and say there is such a thing called affirmative actions, the conservative has been fighting that for 45 to almost 50 years and finally resulted in the Harvard case. And that's why this is so significant and kind of causes us to think, right, what is the future for Malaysia? And we're not saying we have the same legal foundation. We don't. We have a constitution that allows for affirmative action, unfortunately. But I think as a society, as a people group, as a nation, we can be honest in discussing whether... I mean, we have NEP for more than 35 years already. In fact, you can say NEP still continues, all right?
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, directly or indirectly, GLC is one of the manifestations. GLC basically controls the whole economy of this nation. So one way or another, I think people have to own up to that. But that's the next episode, hopefully. But anyway, Lyra, Tucker also mentioned, and maybe you'd like to elaborate on this, on the whole thing about the civil rights movement, right? Because all of a sudden, they won. They got what they want. So the Democratic Party needed to do something else, and we call that, whatever you want to call it, victimhood. instigating victimhood, siege mentality. Sound familiar, right? But maybe you like to just comment on that. I know it's a very, very cynical approach, but when you are a party that fights for civil rights and you won, how do you continue to maintain your relevance?
It was very interesting because if you just read how George Orwell, he was just writing in 1984, basically you need some sort of theory to champion so that people continue to submit to your authority. So I think that's really the whole concept of what the Democratic Party is really embracing, because suddenly, oops, I have no cause anymore. So then they come up with this whole concept of affirmative action. So the whole idea was really, I'm just quoting from Tucker Carlson, that it was to punish or reward Americans based on the color of their skin. I mean, in Malaysia, we are really no stranger to this whole thing. And yet, it was so absurd that a country that is so free would introduce something like this, that you are, because it continued here by quoting Tucker Carlson, ironically, this was precisely the evil practice that the civil rights movement was designed to abolish. So it's kind of like an oxymoron sort of thing, because after you have won this, then you decided to counter it. So that, I guess it's really strategic, because even if we look at the whole COVID era, basically you need something to just like, you create lies upon lies upon lies, so that people are so entrapped in the whole system of lies that we can't really discern truth from lies anymore, or relative truth for that matter. So I think what they are really doing here is really, I mean, it's really absurd to really just think about this whole thing, because it's really, really oxymoron. There's no other way to describe it.
In Malaysia, we're also familiar, right? I mean, when you have the constitution giving the Malays special rights, and yet for years and years, UMNO kept saying that the Malays were under siege. And when you have NEP, when you have the economic equilibrium already, when you have almost all the senior, civil service, the senior judges, all the ministers are all under one race, and yet you say your race are under threat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I really have to bring in these statistics, because back in 2022, at that time, we still had the Prime Minister, Ismail Sabri. So this minister from the Prime Minister's department, so he basically replied to Teresa Kok, so by saying that actually there are about 90% of 1.2 million civil servants are Bumiputras. I mean, you cannot unsee the whole thing, that there is some sort of racial preference that is really going on here, despite him saying that, no, I mean, we are just looking for the best and quality candidates that is chosen. And yet, you really wonder if there's such systemic sort of way of filtering.
Of course, when it comes to recruitments, there is the expressway, we don't want certain race, for example. But then their defense will be, for example, the non-Bumiputra do not want to become police. They do not want to become soldier. But then, of course, we have to look back. Why is it that they do not want? Is it because of your policy? Is it because they cannot get promotion? Is it because of discrimination? So if we want to really advance as a nation, I think these are very, very difficult. I mean, we are not denying that it's a difficult question. But we as a nation will have to be very honest in our assessment. That's why the whole Harvard case kind of make me think about what's happening in our country. And we know even the Malays are seeing that this cannot continue. And it's good that they see that, but what is the way out? I think that is still not yet settled. But anyway, I wanted to talk about some of the things that was uncovered. Now when the legal case reached the Supreme Court, usually it has gone through many phases. You have the trial stage, you have the first appeal, you could have even a second appeal. So scotters could be the third or fourth appeal already. So each round you try to have discussion, points of law, but sometimes you have you have presentation of facts and evidence. Now I say this more for the benefit of our audience and listeners who are not familiar with legal process. But we want to discuss some of the things that came out in the whole trial, right, which are just so ridiculous, right? So in the trial, in fact, there was there was a study by Princeton University sociology. His name is called Thomas Espenshade, okay, 2009. So these are some of the things that put in. Now, in a trial, you can put in whatever evidence you want. Whether it has weight or not is a different issue. But this is an actual study. And they look at some selective schools and universities in the country and how they intentionally boost black persons' applications. How do they do that? Based on that Princeton study, if you are a white person, your SAT, now SAT is their college admission score, it's like A level for those British-based education. If you are a white person, your SAT will be penalized, deduct 310 points. Okay, what about Asians? We know Asians are doing very well, right? I mean, they're called the maths genius. Okay, you are good with maths. I'm not good with maths. And Asians, worse than white. You are penalized 450 points because Asians are too good with calculus. So it's like, I mean, this is systemic racism, don't you think?
Indeed.
And how is this even allowed? Okay, then another very interesting thing, which around the same time as the appeal was being, the Scotus decided we will hear it. Then 82 companies decided to file amicus brief. Now, amicus basically means we are friend of court. We come here because we are interested in a case and we want to present certain things. So these amicus 82 companies, what do you think they're trying to do?
Defend.
They're trying to support Harvard and UNC, right? So guess who are these companies? Big companies, okay? Apple, Google, Meta, Starbucks, GE, etc., etc., etc. What is their justification? More diversity. Okay, so you see the whole thing, now we're all very familiar with ESG, right? ESG is more the environmental thing, it's more the green thing, but less well known is the social element of ESG. It's called DEI. And it's called diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And this is very, very prevalent in higher education, especially in the United States. Because imagine they have this affirmative action for 45 years. Actually, longer than Malaysia, you think about it. So it's like, longer than our NEP, actually almost the same time. And so, but the whole thing is, look, when you have this kind of thing, you're trying to say, you make it because of your skin color. Don't you think that's the greatest insult? Because you're Asian, therefore you are admitted. Because you're Asian, you can do calculus. It's like, what happens to the Asians who can't do math? It's like so ridiculous, right? But the amicus brief, this is what they said in our actual filing. Research and experience, you see, they always say research. What kind of research, right? Demonstrate that racial diversity improves decision making by increasing creativity, communication, and accuracy within teams. That sounds very, I don't know, very DI. But then during the whole appeal stage, when you go to appeal, you have to talk to the Supreme Court Justice. So North Carolina Solicitor General, so the state government actually wanted to help UNC also. Can you imagine? The state government are in favor of affirmative action. We already mentioned there's nothing worse than when the authority structure, the legal system supports it. That's why NEP, with a good intention of balancing the economy, but the implementation was really, really bad. And it should have never been linked back to the special rights of Malay. Because NEP, do you remember NEP wasn't supposed to be race-based, right? Yep. It was supposed to be just based on whoever is in need. It was designed as a need-based, but somehow it became a race-based kind of thing. But anyway, we are jumping ahead ourselves. We're going to talk about that. But I want to just kind of point to the short discussion between the Solicitor General Ryan Park and Justice Clarence Thomas. Very, very short one. I'm just going to read. So they were just talking about what was the education benefit of affirmative action. So Solicitor General Park said,
so the most concrete possible scenario is stock trading. And there are studies that find that racially diverse groups of people making trading decisions perform at a higher level, make more efficient trading decisions. And the mechanism there is that it reduces groupthink and people have longer and more sustained disagreement. And that leads to a more efficient outcome.
Well, I guess I don't put much stock in that because I've heard similar arguments in favor of segregation too.
And this reminds me of a friend of ours, right? And he say, look, every time people don't want you to understand something, they will come up with very, very long technical quote. I mean, this Ryan Park, I think he's trying to confuse people. But anyway, Clarence Thomas, of course, doesn't take the bait. See, they use the word groupthink, but the whole idea that you should support a particular race is groupthink. It's like, that's why this kind of remind me of COVID. It's like there is only a certain way to use a vaccine. There's a certain way to handle lockdown. Or it's not for discussion.
I think another word for groupthink that we could really come out now is systemic brainwashing.
Soviet level brainwash. That's how we like to say. and I think Tucker kind of when he saw this discussion, he was just like sneering and he's like, what WTF? I think he just didn't say it on live TV, but he said, look, the essence is really like this. Give me this because of how I was born. That's the way to sum it. And I think again, that's the root of critical race theory. That's the whole root of wokeness. It's like because it's like making excuses, right? Because I'm born like this, I'm disadvantaged forever. I think you're just doing a great disservice to a great culture. I mean, the black culture is great. The Malay culture is great. How can we reduce them to this? You are basically creating them, making them like rubbish, right?
Yeah. I think I must really quote from this Erica Marsh, because I think she's the Joe Biden's White House speaker.
Yeah, I think one of it, she sounded familiar.
Yeah, so basically what she quoted on the day of the verdict, she said, today's Supreme Court's decision is a direct attack on black people. No black person will be able to succeed in a merit-based system.
Wow, what a put down to your own race.
Exactly. I mean, then she was saying, which is exactly why affirmative action-based programs were needed. Today's decision is a travesty. I'm like, are you absurd? Are you throwing shades at the black people?
I think you have to be total idiot to agree with that. I mean, that's why one of the things that I started to see, the aftermath of the whole discussion, and we're going to talk about one article later on, is that if there is proper exposure, if there's proper discussion, people will just find this totally ridiculous. And I think it's really the way the media has been blindsiding people, the censorship of big tech and things like that. That's why people remain, quote unquote, we talk about low information voter, and this is exactly what low information can do to you. You think there's nothing, but they are very, very selective. But now this Erica was not even being selective, but she was totally unhinged and manifesting, don't you think? So I think that's what is needed. And it's good that she said that in national TV and things like that, because that's another thing that Tucker Carlson was saying in November. Now the Democratic Party will be forced to defend affirmative actions, and they're not doing a great job so far. But anyway, we want to close soon, but before we look at the final article, I'm just going to show you some additional statistics. And maybe Lara, you like to say all this. Maybe you go through this because it kind of just blow our mind away, right?
Yes. So quoting Tucker Carlson, so he said more than 50% of the blacks went into Harvard because of their skin color. 50%. That's crazy. Then another one is about 1/3 of Hispanics were able to enter Harvard because of their skin color. And these are not disputable. These are admitted facts at trial stage. It is crazy. I mean, because the whole basis of admission process so tedious, because I think they had like 40 members looking through your admissions. Mm-hmm. The main thing was for them to prevent dramatic drop-offs.
Yep.
And if you go back to read College Scam by Charlie Kirk, he basically said this whole university scheme is a scam because you basically have about 40% that will drop out.
Yep.
But in the first place, if you could tighten up the process, not based on their skin color, but based on the merit, based on their quality, you admit them, then you actually reduce the drop-off. But you're doing the exact thing that will ensure dramatic drop-offs. So it's crazy.
This is our business model, but it is a racist business model. But anyway, we want to come to an end already of today's discussion, and I want to show this news article from CNN, okay? So it's called Why There Won't Be a backlash against the Supreme Court this time. You see, they are in a somber mood, right? And because they knew that the public opinion was against them. So in this article, they kind of talk about Roe v. Wade, the overturning, because Roe v. Wade, somehow they managed to, of course, there are different points of view. It really depends on the different state, where you are from. But we already mentioned previously in our one of our episodes, the Dobbs decision was not even to ban abortion. It was really to push the decision on abortion back to the states, as it should be. Nobody is banning anything.
Yep.
But somehow it's very, very emotional, But anyway, they kind of highlighted and say, look, at that time, because of the way the news is kind of manipulated, public opinion was against that. Well, I'm not too sure on that, because I've seen a lot of support on Dobbs' decision. But anyway, then they point out to this Harvard ruling, right? Before the case was decided, they show polls such as CBS News, your government news. These are mainstream polling. It shows that up to 70% of those polled, they wanted affirmative action to end. It's like, case closed. It's like in a society that promotes the American dream, I will not believe that you get even close to a portion of people who will allow these kind of things to happen. And that's why this decision, I believe, it needs to be discussed widely. And of course, this decision came along two other blockbuster decisions, which we don't have time to discuss, but it's really a smackdown to the liberal leftist people. So Lara, what are your, I know we're going to spend another episode to talk about Malaysia, right? But what are your concluding thoughts? We go through this case, you read the judgment. What's your overall feeling from this,
Well, I think I am very, very hopeful for the same to happen in Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, maybe there wasn't enough discussion that was even permissible by our constitution on all this racial preference. But I felt like as a maturing democracy, we could eventually move towards that direction, because as we begin to see how the Prime Minister is advocating for need-based system rather than racial, I think that is really hope for Malaysia. So for the people out there, we really should think of creative ways how to defend all these cases so that we begin to see a greater prosperity for Malaysia, because that's really what we are wanting. Regardless of the race, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your religion, your belief system, your ideology, I think what people are really wanting is the way to prosper in Malaysia. How do you have that happiness in Malaysia? That's really the whole concept of this whole podcast that we are really advocating for. And I really like what former President Trump, so he basically he pledged to eliminate diversity, exclusivity, and
DEI, right?
DEI, yes. So he basically mentioned that he will eliminate all diversity or equity and inclusion programs across the entire federal government. And I think that's really the hope for Malaysia.
Yeah, for a person like him who was self-made, of course, he really kind of represents the American dream. And, then come to Malaysia, my thoughts would be, there is some link with the Green Wave, because the Green Wave, no matter how you want to put it, the 3R is a central discussion. So really at the end of the day, I think we have to hear those who have concern over 3R. Because, in Malaysia, it's very straightforward. The Malay, the Muslim are majority. They will have to come to a realization. Maybe realization is a wrong word. They have to come to a place where they want to move away from, because it's a new generation. Most were not even born in 1957. Most were not even born in 1963. So it's for the new generation to decide what kind of society you want, because increasingly we are seeing we are lagging behind Indonesia, we're lagging behind Thailand, we're lagging behind Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei. Can you imagine?
It's Southeast Asia partners.
Yeah, and once upon a time we'll consider the most bright star, right? So I think people need to have a real analysis of what's happening and be very, very honest about what kind of society we want to be. And that's for the current and next generation to decide. But anyway, I think that's all the time we have for today. It's been very, very interesting. And I think we will talk about the Malaysian affirmative actions in another episode.
Yep.
Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.